So there was a county in Alabama, Bibb County, Bloody Bibb they called it. It was a dry county. You know what dry counties are? Couldn't buy alcohol, right? And there were two brothers who controlled Bibb County, and they were bootleggers, they were moonshiners, anything that was bad to be illegal, they did it. They controlled the county, and they were vile people. And one day, one of the brothers died. And the surviving brother went to the pastor of a little Methodist church that was probably $50,000 behind in their budget. And he went up to the pastor and said, Pastor, I want you to do my brother's funeral. And I want you to say that he was a saint. And the pastor knew this guy pretty well, you know. And the brother said, here's a check for $50,000. I think this will cover your budget. Pastor thought about it. He said, okay. Took the check. They made the arrangements for the funeral. And at the funeral, the pastor said, what we have laying here today is one of the lowest dogs I've ever met. He's lower than a snake. He was a scoundrel, a liar, a cheat, probably a murderer, and a known adulterer. But compared to his brother sitting here today, he was a saint. He'd already cashed that check. And he survived to tell the story. So, yeah, I have a prepared text that I don't want to preach it. What's a saint? What's a saint? Come on, interactive Sunday.
Someone who does good for other people.
Someone who does good for other people. Have you ever known a saint? I think we named some today. As I was actually sitting here this morning, I remembered a saint that I knew as a young boy. I lived in a very interesting neighborhood in Alabama in the 60s, and it was a narrow avenue, probably just a little wider than a mile here, that a car could get through it. On one side were African American, and the other were white folks. And there was a little lady who lived on the avenue in a shack. I mean, it was a shack. And her name was Zula. Zula Battle. And every Christmas, Zula would have rock candy for all of us, you know, kids, regardless of what we looked like. She had candy for us. And she would occasionally stop me and send me down to the store to buy BC powders or snuff. You know, so you know what snuff is, right? One day, when I was probably not much older than Jackson or Peter, my friends and I were playing Army, and we were throwing rocks as hand grenades through the hedge. And I am ashamed to say that I was a little too energetic in my rock throwing, and it went through Zula's window. And I did not go to her and apologize for months. And finally, you know, I finally got it up the courage to go. And she said, Bobby, I knew it was you, and I forgive you. I'm not sad that you broke my window. That happens, but I'm sad that you didn't come to me before now to apologize. And I think that was my first introduction to a saint, knowing what she had to go through in her life as an African-American woman in the South in the 50s and 60s, and the grace she showed to me and to the other kids in the neighborhood was nothing short of saintly, I think. You see, that's what we're called to. We're called to be saints. We're called to embrace God's grace, to make us saints. This reading from Daniel, this strange reading, isn't it? Did you think about it as you're reading it? It gets stranger if you listen to the parts in between. And the parts in between describe these monsters who rise up out of the sea. One of them, the fourth one, says, a fourth animal appeared in my dream. This one was a grizzly horror, hideous. It had huge iron teeth It crunched and swallowed its victims. Anything left over, it trampled into the ground. And it goes on describing this horrible, horrible beast. And of course, Daniel was written about 150 years before the birth of Christ. And it was an allegory, an apocalyptic allegory about what was happening in his own time. But he describes these beasts as being, they were nations, Persia and Greece. But the image of that beast has been with me all week. The beast that were destroying Israel. The beast that was keeping Israel from being a nation of saints. And I want to ask you this morning, what are the monsters in your closets? What are the monsters hiding under your beds? What are those monsters you carry inside your heart that keep you from being the saint He's called to be? Fear, maybe fear. I just can't cross that line, Lord, and turn my other cheek. Is it rage? Anybody angry here? You don't have to show your hands. But what is it? We all have something that keep us from being the saint that we're called to be. Maybe it's the monster of just being tired all the time. Have you ever been, are you just tired all the time? Maybe it's a monster of not knowing what's coming next. You know what your monster is. You know what that beast is rising up that's keeping you from being the person God has called you to be. The good news today is the same good news 2,000 years ago. God's grace is so great that it can overcome any beast that rises out of our fear. Paul writes, he says, perfect love casts out all fear. Allow God's grace to start working in your lives so that you might be the saint, maybe the one saint that someone encounters in their life. Know that you have victory through Christ. Know that God's grace is working in you. If you call on God's grace. I wish, this is the southerner in me, I guess, an old-timey one of that. I wish we had an altar where we could pray. I think there's power in coming to the altar and praying. To say, God, I have no control over what I'm battling right now. Give me your grace. We have, in the Methodist Church, we have 3 kinds of grace we talk about, right? We have, remember your confirmation classes, prevenient grace, which is the grace that reaches out to us even before we know God. Then we have justifying grace, which is that grace that says to us, you are saved through the love of Christ. There's nothing you can do to earn God's favor, but it's God's grace that saves you. Isn't that good news? That there's nothing you have to do, that all you have to do is call on God's grace and you are set free? That's good news. That's justifying grace. Perfecting grace is another word for it. At annual conference, pastors have to gather together, and we are asked by the bishop every year, are you moving towards perfection? We all look at our shoes. But are you moving towards perfection? God's grace perfects us. And then the third grace is the one we need to be praying every day. Especially in these times where there's so much going on around us. God's sanctifying grace. God's grace that transforms us. God's grace that subtly, just through slowly, turns us into those saints. Do you believe it? You are saints. God's grace is working in you now to be saints. Paul, writing to the Corinthians, says, you are saints. And the Corinthian church, if you read it carefully, it sounded like it was made up of a whole slew of those old two brothers I was talking about. They were cheaters, adulterous. The Corinthians were a church full of scoundrels. And yet Paul saw God's hand on that church. Paul saw them in the light of who they were, but he also saw them in the light of who they were called to be, saints of God. And so I ask you today, go home today and just start praying that God's, bless you, God's sanctifying grace would start working in your life. Because I know you're not scoundrels. I know you pretty well after 7 months. You're a good group of folks. But God's grace will take us further into holiness, further into sanctity. And my prayer is that one day, I don't want to turn my back on you, one day when people look at Memorial, they'll remember Memorial as being that church full of saints. That church who, when I walked through its doors, I felt the holiness of God lived out through the people who came every Sunday. That's my prayer. That's what I believe is going to happen. And that's all I've got to say about it. I could read you a fairly boring sermon. I feel like the Spirit is here now to tell us, move forward in holiness. That's our charge for the coming year, to move forward into holiness. Amen.